Dr. Taryn Marie, welcome to the Mindset Advantage podcast. It's such a joy to have you here today. I just finished reading your incredible book, The Five Practices of Highly Resilient People. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. What an honor and a delight to be here with you today.
Absolutely. We have a lot of great topics to get into, everything under the umbrella of resilience. I think first, before we get into the nuts and bolts of the book, I first want to know, where did this all begin for you? Where did you start to scratch the itch of resilience, and where did the journey start? What's the genesis, Dr. Taryn?
Yeah, such a great question. So I think for so many of us, something that's true is we really understand our life, in hindsight, in looking back. And so even in the moment when the dots don't seem to sort of line up, in looking back and hindsight being 2020, we're like, oh, that was it. So for me, in third grade, I was in the lowest reading group. And I'd been in the lowest reading group for first and second grade. So I get to third grade, and like so many of us, I saw more for myself. I wanted to get into that highest reading group. And so I went to my teacher, Mrs. Robinson, I'll never forget. And I said, by the end of this semester, I am going to be in the highest reading group. And I don't think she knew what to make of that. She gave me this sort of skeptical look. I went back to my desk and every day wrote down the words that I couldn't pronounce, the words that I couldn't read. And every night at home in my bedroom by myself with my little lamp at my desk, I would practice those words. And there's some really hard words out there, right? It's like, when we really think about it, like neighbor, EIGH, way, EIGH. So practice and practice. Sure enough, by the end of that semester, I ascended not one, but two reading groups into the highest reading group. Now, a funny thing happened 30 years later that provided some information that would have been very useful at the time. I was diagnosed with dyslexia at the age of 37. So I managed to make it through not only high school, not only college, but a doctorate program and two fellowships that were funded by the National Institute of Health without necessarily knowing that I had a learning disability and needed accommodation or could have used some accommodations in my learning. So, not all of us will be diagnosed with learning disabilities. What we all have experienced are moments of facing challenge when we knew that we saw something more for ourselves, but we didn't know how to get there. And we weren't sure that anyone else was going to be able to help us, right? Mrs. Robinson didn't say, I'll help you, no problem, we'll get you a teacher's aide. And we've all experienced moments where we felt deeply alone when we were facing challenge. For me, I was alone in my bedroom practicing words. For you, might be alone in your house, alone in your car. So looking back, what I see from a very young age, and this is true for many of us, is that challenge shows up in our life really early. And when I looked back on that and I thought, gosh, I felt so alone and so confused. And I said, what would it be like if we understood that there are some commonalities amongst all of us, that when we face challenge, there's a couple things that we can do that will create a more positive and productive outcome. And so that's really what got me interested in resilience, is the idea of how do we effectively face the challenge, the change, and the complexity that inevitably shows up in our lives.
Hmm. Before we dive even deeper, I want to continue to set the table here. Dr. Taryn, what's the definition of resilience? Can we start there first?
Absolutely. So I'm sure you and your listeners have seen a lot of definitions for resilience, and I have too. The definition for resilience that I developed after interviewing hundreds of people and collecting thousands of pieces of data is a little bit different and a little bit more simplified, which I think we can all appreciate. So it's about facing those 3C moments, the challenge, the change, and the complexity. And it's about allowing ourselves to ultimately be enhanced by that experience, not diminished. And I think what's powerful about this definition, and I talk about it in my book, The Five Practices of Highly Resilient People, is both the simplicity of that definition and also what's not included there. What we don't see in that definition are things that we're probably used to reading, things like quickly recover. We know that based on the work that I've done, that the most resilient people are actually not the ones that are the fastest to recover, not the fastest to return to the sports field, not the ones who come back to work the most quickly. And we've typically talked about in the definition of resilience that people bounce back, that we go back to a prior state. And one of the pervasive myths of resilience that I had the opportunity to uncover and really unpack is that there's a lot of people teaching that we bounce back. I'm teaching that we bounce forward. We allow ourselves to be fundamentally and forever changed by our experience. And that's more true. I think if you or any of our listeners think about a challenge that we faced, what we recognize is that none of us went back to the way that we were before, and yet we demonstrated tremendous resilience.
I'm so glad you pointed out those two. That's what I had in my notes as well. I want to go back to the speed of time. Can you elaborate more on that? Because I think there's so much truth to that. Is coming back to work after a traumatic event. The quicker you do that, talk to me a little bit more about that. I think that's so interesting. That's not the way we should view a resilient person. It's not the speed that they get over it. So what does it look like instead? Talk a little more about that.
Sure. Yeah. So, I think we live in a world that really rewards us and at times expects us just to like get over it and come back. And we think, wow, that person had surgery on Friday and they're back at their desk on Monday. Isn't that amazing and wonderful? Right. And what we find is oftentimes the people that, come back the most quickly, the people that come back to work after something traumatic happening, the people that start to get back to work after, a physical health concern, athletes that go back on the field before they're fully healed. These are often the folks, they come back sooner, but they have more complications and oftentimes more missed games, more missed days of work, because in fact, we haven't given ourselves the time to emotionally, mentally, and physically heal. And so even though we think we're doing a great thing, by coming back quickly to support our peers at work, to support our teams. In fact, we're doing ourselves and everyone a greater disservice because these are the folks that actually have more complications later on.
Right. Okay. So we have a great definition. A couple of the myths are that it's not bouncing back; it's moving forward, and there's really no time dimension on a resilient person. Phenomenal. The book is 5 practices, and I love it because it tells me that there's action and that there's behaviors to this. You're not just born with it. Maybe that's another myth that this is something that you can develop, much like mental performance and a growth mindset. Which, to speak to kind of my world, talk to me a little bit about the before we get into the 5 practices. Why is it, Dr. Taryn? Why is it a practice? What does that mean? How can we continue to build the muscle of resilience?
There's so many great questions there. I love it.
Feel free to pick
I love
one.
it. Yeah. Okay. Well, let's start as we're continuing to set the table for all of our listeners. Let me start with the first thing that you asked, which is about this sort of active, element of resilience. So, one of the things I've loved about this work, and I always hoped that I would have the opportunity to contribute, is some of the authors that I admire the most, the Daniel Pinks of the world, the Malcolm Gladwells of the world. What they've done in my life is they've taken a concept or something that commonly occurs for me and a belief, right, that I didn't even realize that I held, and they challenge it and they unpack it and they unfurl it and they turn it around in such a way that I'm like, oh my gosh, this whole different world exists for me that's been hiding in plain sight. And so I've been so excited to do something similar to that with resilience, to take some of the commonly held beliefs that we don't even recognize. We're saying to people, like, I hope you bounce back. And it's like, well, bouncing back is for Tupperware and bouncing forward is for humans, right? And to get to look at some of these things. So another one that you mentioned is this active way that we are resilient. So often we say to ourselves in the English language, time heals all wounds, and what does that tell us? It just tells us that it's the passive passing of time. And in fact, it's more akin to something Andy Warhol said, where he said, time does change things and you have to change them yourselves.
Mm.
And I think that's important because what that tells us, and I think what the sort of ethos of the five practices is that this is about recognizing the things in our lives that we have control over, and then exerting control over the things that are within that sphere of control or within that sphere of influence. So when challenge shows up in our lives, oftentimes we feel very disenfranchised, confused, out of control. We're saying to ourselves, what are we going to do? What am I going to do? And so what the five practices does is it gives us a roadmap to resilience that is entirely within our control. And it's an active process. It's about us showing up and engaging with what is happening right before us. Now, the good news is, the second thing that you mentioned before we kind of dive into the practices themselves is you sort of teased, are we born with resilience? A lot of times people ask me, right? Like, are resilient leaders born or made? And what I say is all resilient leaders are born. And over the course of our life, we become more resilient. So one of the things that I start out with in my book is that resilience is the essence of being human. And this is important because so many people are coming to resilience and they're saying like, am I going to be found out that I'm, not resilient enough? Is this just going to be like another thing in my life that I'm going to get to feel bad about? And the answer is no, because resilience is the essence of being human. We've all survived every disappointment, loss, crisis, rejection, turn of events that was unexpected, and we're all still here. And we didn't receive any special training for that to happen. So what that means is there are things that exist inside of us. In fact, there's a word called silience. It's spelled the same way you take the R-E off resilience and it's silience. It's actually a word that I didn't even know existed. It means to uncover within us hidden talents, strengths, and capabilities. And so when we know that, then it's like, oh, these challenges that show up in our lives that we can't engineer out and we don't want to are actually meant to help us, remind us, or uncover for the first time the strengths that already exist within us. And when resilience is inextricably tied to our humanity, what it means is we can't be lacking. We can't be enough or not enough because it comes with us wherever we go.
Mm. Wow, phenomenal. Thanks for the teaching on the new word. I'm writing that one down. I love that. What a great word. Okay, so let's get into the five. There's some great stuff in here. And before I got into the five, I'm thinking to myself, where's she going with this? What could the five be? I'm kind of coming up with five in my head, and boom, practice of vulnerability comes first. And it gave me this like, oh, I didn't expect that to be on the list. Nonetheless, number one. So talk to me about vulnerability. You talked about matching our inside self with our outside self. This is so true. I just didn't expect it to be right there, number one. Go ahead and take the floor. Why is practice vulnerability such a big topic?
You had such a parallel experience to me when I was doing this work, because I think it's important for us to mention for our listeners that this, just, wasn't me at my dining room table, coming up with five practices that sounded good next to each other. This is, 2 decades of interviews with hundreds of people and looking at thousands of pieces of data to ask people, how did they face their most important challenges? What did they do in those moments? And then me listening really closely to understand, are there commonalities amongst us? And then, when I found that yes, okay, what are those commonalities? And so someone just asked me during a keynote when I was on stage, they said, well, if you were going to make a sixth practice, what would you make that? And I said, well, it's important to note that like I didn't make the practices.
Mm.
I simply listened to what hundreds of people told me. And then I, put that into categories. So, for me and for you, when vulnerability emerged as the first practice that we identified that was associated with resilience, I too was both surprised and I was convicted
Mm.
because I had lived my life very happily, I might add, as a very invulnerable person.
Mhm.
And
Me too.
so, yes, right. Like, hello, all of us, card carrying, like vulnerable. No, thank you. We're good over here. And so what it did is it was a call for me to really look at that in my own life and then also find a way to unpack it for the rest of us. Now, I love Brene Brown's work. For those of you that are familiar with Brene Brown around vulnerability. And I think what's exciting about the 5 practices in vulnerability is we actually claim new ground in this area of vulnerability. So every time that I've read Brene Brown's work, I'm just tremendously blown away by her brilliance, her insight. And I've also wondered, okay, like, all right, so we know vulnerability is good for us. But we're not like running around living our most fabulous, vulnerable lives. What stands in the way? So the first thing is actually how we understand vulnerability. Vulnerability is not about self-deprecation. It's not about discrediting ourselves. That's the kind of stuff that like we did on the middle school playground. Like, let me point out, my insecurities and my faults before anybody else does. And so vulnerability is about allowing our inside self, our thoughts, feelings, and experiences to as closely as possible match what we're sharing with the external world, on the outside. And so the more that we're able to allow our inside self to match our outside self, the more vulnerability we're engaging in. And that's also important because when we think about this era of human connectivity, where many people feel even more disconnected than ever, vulnerability is the cornerstone of empathy and authenticity. We can't empathize with someone or be authentic without first tapping into something that's vulnerable within us. So when we think about leadership, on the sports field, in the office, being able to be that authentic and empathetic leader means we first get to tap into that vulnerability.
Mm, I love it. There's a part in your book I'd like to read because I think it really highlights the difference of the types of vulnerability. It says performative vulnerability is posturing, sometimes attention seeking, or even at times manipulative. It's a way of saying, look at me, that is more of a transaction than an interaction. Performative vulnerability is about telling people a story to manage their impressions of you. It's about feeding our personal ego by seeking recognition, gaining followers, or wanting to be seen in a certain light rather than seeking personal connection. On the other side, genuine vulnerability is focused on enhancing human connection and is greater and more meaningful than impression management or bolstering reputations. Genuine vulnerability is an attempt to be authentic and understood, to have the courage to be seen and known as our authentic selves, to give people a peek at our humanity with the desire to bring others closer to us. I love that because it really paints a picture between those two. Because I think we all know the vulnerable person that's pity me, feel bad for me. I'm telling all my sad stories so you feel bad for me. The distinction there is really important.
It's really important. When we think about vulnerability, I have people who say to me, when I'm giving workshops and when I'm doing trainings, they say, well, my company doesn't, allow for vulnerability. My company doesn't like vulnerability. And I say, so your company doesn't like human connection? And they're like, oh, well, all right. So it's about really recognizing that vulnerability is is an art and the science around, matching people that with the environment that we're in, if that's, in a place of work, how that aligns with our particular culture and doing it in a way that's acceptable inside of that particular culture. And what it also means is, oftentimes performative vulnerability can look like genuine vulnerability. But what we get to ask ourselves anytime we take the risk and face the fear of being vulnerable is, am I doing this to posture or to reputation manage, or am I doing this to form a genuine human connection with others?
Mhm. Yeah. Oh man, that's so good. There's no I don't have a scientific term for this, Dr. Taryn, but when my inner self, my inner thoughts and all that, if that matches and I have that congruency, when I live that life in alignment, it feels good. I feel good. I feel lighter, less stressed, less anxious. I know there's not a scientific term for that, but man, life is good when the inside and the outside are matching themselves.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think you talked about alignment. I think that's a beautiful term. Being congruent is something that we talk about in psychology. One of the ways that vulnerability is really powerful, especially in moments of challenge, is if we're feeling some kind of way on the inside or having an experience, and then on the outside, we're trying to put on a facade and make things look good. What that means is we're running two different human operating systems. And in that way, just in a moment of challenge, when we actually need that energetic capital the most, we're burning it twice as fast because we've got an inside thing going on and then we're trying to, be something different on the outside. So to your point, when you feel more positive, when you feel more relaxed, calm, grace, and ease, you've got more energy. It's because we're not running two different human operating systems simultaneously.
Yes, yes, yes. I would be curious to ask, do you have a time in your 20 years of research and working with teams where you saw the practice of vulnerability play out when you were like this? Do you have a great story, an example of where you saw this firsthand?
Oh, absolutely. So, it's interesting because I think this is a great story around how sometimes we can think vulnerability is one thing. And in fact, it can be another. And so, one of the stories that I tell in my book is about a woman that I was coaching, an executive that I was working with. And she was a high potential inside of our organization. And so one of the things that we do with our high potential talent inside of organizations is we pluck them out of, kind of their area of comfort, and we give them a rotational opportunity someplace else in the company where they have really no experience and they've got to, kind of learn on the ground. And so this woman, was a vice president in the area of marketing, and she was transitioning into a VP role over in operations. So she and I were talking during her executive coaching session. And I said, well, have you thought about how you're going to introduce yourself to your team? And she said, oh, I'm just going to go in there and I'm going to tell them that I'm not even really sure why I got this promotion. I don't know anything about operations, and she goes on. And I said, well, what do you think you're doing there? And she said, I'm being vulnerable. I said, no, I think you're discrediting yourself. And so then what we did in the context of that conversation is we figured out how she could demonstrate genuine vulnerability in a way that created connection and credibility with her team that didn't, discredit her from day one. And so instead of what she was going to say, she went in there and said, look, I've been at this company for 20 years. I've got a deep understanding of our products and services. I've had the opportunity to work my way up to a VP level role in marketing. And now I am so excited for this new opportunity to learn over here in operations. Now, let me tell you, I am not a subject matter expert. I've got a lot to learn. I'm going to be leaning on all of you as a team. We're putting together our strategic plan. I'm so excited to accomplish things and win with you. And I'm really looking forward to learning from you. And that's a way that we can shift the script from thinking, oh, I'm just going to go in and be vulnerable, and say, no, I'm going to say what's true. And I'm also going to talk about my credentials and what I'm excited and looking forward to, and how that develops a deeper relationship of connection and credibility with our people.
Hmm. Isn't it funny how the practice of vulnerability as a byproduct creates trust, whether it's employees or significant other? I mean, that those two words kind of go together. We might not think that being vulnerable will create trust because I think what most people think, maybe myself included, is that the other person is going to think different of you or think down on you or shut you out of the group. But in reality, what happens more is that you start to trust the person because they've let you in a little bit on what's going on in their life. They're not this perfect image that's always in a suit and doesn't make any mistakes. It's like, oh, you're one of us. I have more trust for you. What's your thoughts on trust and vulnerability?
Yeah, I think we're all, as humans, we have and will continue to crave what is true. We want to be able to grab onto I'm trying to think of the word for this. We want to be able to grab onto the immovable kind of touch points in our lives where we can say, this is true, and many things can shift and change around us. Something that I wrote in the book, and I think didn't make it into the final version, which is really great to talk about around vulnerability and trust, is I talked about the story of the phoenix, that legend of a bird and rising from the ashes and being victorious. It's almost cliche at this point, and many people know that story. What fewer people know about the story of the phoenix is that the phoenix lights its own nest on fire.
Mm.
It's not in response, to like a forest fire or something. The phoenix is the originator of the spark that starts the fire. And then we say to ourselves, why would the phoenix light its own nest on fire? Because periodically in our lives, there are moments, with our, sort of in our control or outside of our control, where things figuratively, or maybe literally, if people have had an experience with a fire in their home, things burn down. They burn down to the ground. And what happens in those moments is the things that are true cannot be incinerated. The real friendships, the real love, the things that matter in those moments of crisis, that doesn't go up in the ashes. And so vulnerability for us is a way that we want to connect with something that's true. We can throw our arms around and say, come hell or high water, right? I'm going to be able to hold on to this and ground into my life because I know this is real.
Mm. And that parlays right into number 2, which is the practice of productive perseverance. And if I'm reading this correctly, I'm learning correctly, it's about staying on the mission, pursuing the goal, even if you don't know if you can make it. I work in the fitness space as well, Dr. Taryn, and this is huge, right? Where we set out for this goal, and there's so many trials and tribulations. I'm not sure if I can do this. It'd be easier if I just didn't during those dark days. But the power of perseverance, sticking through, even though we want to shift gears. Talk to me a little about practice number 2.
Yeah, so productive perseverance is there's two sides to the coin, right? So one of those sides, you're correct, is about continuing to pursue, say, our goals and dreams, the mission, if you will, despite challenge. The other side of that coin is pivoting in a new direction or wholesale shifting our focus in the face of diminishing returns. And, one of the things that I was really fascinated by, and a lot of people ask me about, is they say, well, do resilient people always persevere? Or do resilient people, the answer is, no. You know, Having the courage to be able to pivot and adjust our sails, especially in the face of diminishing returns, is as important as continuing to put, our head down in the face of challenge. And in the words of Angela Duckworth, to be gritty. And so what productive, we talked about with vulnerability, it's, about what's happening for us inside. And it's also about calibrating what's happening outside of ourselves in the environment. And the same thing is true for productive perseverance. It's about recognizing our goals and aspirations and dreams and what we want to do relative to our fitness. And then it's calibrating that inside of what's available in our environment. And so, if we also think about this from a company standpoint, right? There are lots of companies, right? Some names will come to mind, that, continue to persevere toward their goals, even as the environment was shifting and changing. And ultimately, that change led to, and the company's inability to change led to that company no longer being in existence. It's like, when was the last time you, went to Blockbuster to rent your movie? You know?
Yeah, it's been a long time. So, what are the steps? I'm curious. There's 2 sides of the coin. It's very delicate. A lot of awareness there. What's the drill? What's the tactile? What can we do to help work on the practice of being persevering?
There's so many things in this practice, actually. So, some of the long, some of the kind of short term, practical elements that I can share today, right? I mean, it's things like, writing out, what is that goal or aspiration? And then, we would call kind of chunking that, into, smaller elements in terms of like how we're going to get to that ultimate goal, planning that out on our calendar, connecting with people who have the skills, knowledge, and abilities to be able to help us on that journey that we don't yet have. Um, and things of that nature in terms of like what happens when we want to pursue a goal. Um, some of the longer term things that I walk people through inside of workshops and training and the online course that I have is also getting to evaluate, what is a plan B, or what's the smallest meaningful pivot that they might make, right? If their first kind of capital G goal isn't available to them. And it's a delicate balance, I think. One of the people that I interviewed for my podcast a while back, his name is Lee Kemp, and he was one of the most acclaimed wrestlers, not WWE wrestler, but like Olympic wrestler. And the year that he was supposed to go to the Olympics, we canceled, you know, the United States participation due to communism and some of the things that were happening geopolitically with Russia and with Germany. And so he was all ready to go to the Olympics. He was favored to get the gold medal, and he never got a shot. And so I asked Lee, I said, okay, 20 years later, knowing that you put all your energy toward this plan A of going to the Olympics and being a gold medal Olympian, and it never came to fruition, what would you tell people about how to set goals? And he said, you know what, Taryn? He said, don't spend too much time on your B plan, or your B plan will become your A plan. And so what was so instructive for me about that is he felt like, despite the fact that there were circumstances outside of his control that prevented him from reaching his goal, because we know the environment's important to consider too, he felt like he left everything on the table and did what he could do inside of his control and influence. And 20 years later, he could look back and say, you know what? I'm tremendously disappointed that that didn't happen. I spent 20 years being angry, and I know that I did everything I could do.
That's awesome. That's the resilient mindset, and you have it on page 64, it being the Mindset Advantage podcast. When I hear something like this, I had to underline it. I'd love to share this. There, you said that there are three common qualities that encompass what I have come to refer to as the resilient mindset. The first thing is a clear desire. Those who flourish are unequivocal about their goal or imagined achievement and unflinching in exactly the vision for what they want to create. First thing is a clear desire. Second is a defined purpose. Those who flourish are unambiguous about their purpose and desire for a specific outcome. And then third, a dogged determination. Those who flourish possess an unwavering focus and passion to achieve their goal. The three steps, or the three pieces of a resilient mindset. It's beautiful.
Thank you. You mentioned growth mindset earlier, and a lot of people have said to me, why did you focus so much on practices and behavior, right? And not as much on mindset. And, one of the things that was important to me was to bring something new into the world. And I felt like there's so much that we can and, collectively are already drawing on in terms of, positive mindset, growth mindset with Carol Dweck. But I did want to talk about resilient mindset, in the context of that paragraph. And, something that has been really instructive for me recently, when we think about those three steps to a resilient mindset. So it's the desire, so something that emerges within ourselves. Ooh, like, I think I want to do this. It's a goal I want to pursue. I want to get fit. I want to, do the next thing. And then we define our purpose. Okay, so why do we want to do that? In service of what? What are we looking to achieve? What's the outcome? And then, here's how we close that chasm, right? Between the chasm between where we are today and where we want to get to in the future is then it's the dogged determination, right? It's continuing in the face of challenge, so long as we're continuing to kind of calibrate, in our environment, if this is still possible for us. And so recently, here's a story I'll give you about this. So recently, my boyfriend came to me and he found this thing on Instagram called the Great American Speak Off. Have you heard of this?
Mm-mm.
No, the Great American Speak Off. Okay, so you might be familiar with Grant Cardone
Mhm.
and Pete Vargas. So Grant Cardone does 10X every year, Growth Con, and he's partnered with Pete Vargas. And they've said, look, there's television shows out there for like, so you think you can dance, America's Got Talent, but there isn't anything for like speakers, people who have a talent for speaking. And so they were gathering people to essentially audition for the Great American Speak Off. And so my boyfriend said, you should do this. You should go do this. And I was like, okay, right. So I within a week, I booked a flight to Miami. I fly there, and there are 4,000 people registered for this thing. 4,000 people are registered for this audition. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is going to be like American Idol. The line's going to be out the door, right? And and right as I was leaving, my boyfriend said something really helpful to me. So the people who are chosen at each location, they get a golden ticket and they choose about 25 people. So 4,000 people register for this thing. 25 people get a golden ticket. And he says to me as I'm leaving, he goes, don't come home without a golden ticket. And I was like, right. Okay. He was kidding. Sort of. Anyway, so I get there and there's, 4,000 people registered for this thing. And I'm looking around and I'm like, it doesn't look like there's 4,000 people here, right? Looks like there's 400. Sure enough, 4,000 people registered to be there in Miami and audition. And 1/10 of the people that registered showed up. 400
Wow.
people showed up. I mean, that made my odds better that I was going to be let back into the house for sure. Right. So, my point is relative to productive perseverance, sometimes it's just about walking through the door. It's just about showing up. Now, everybody that showed up that day did not get a golden ticket. I did get a golden ticket. Right. But for the 400 people that did, we had a chance. And there were 3,600 other people who registered and opened their eyes that morning and said, I can't. It's not for me. I'm not ready. I'm not prepared. I need more training. Maybe next year. Just by showing up, those of us that got there put ourselves in the top 10%. That's powerful.
That's awesome. You got me fired up. A quote that we like to say at our house and within our family is, in order to have a chance, you need to take a chance. If you want to have a chance, you got to take the chance. And life is full of these chances that you either take or you don't. Every day you have these chances. So in order to have a chance, you got to take a chance. What a phenomenal story. That's awesome. Let's go to number 3. The practice of connection. The practice of connection is about navigating our connection to ourselves versus the needs and desire of those in our external network.
Once again, we're unpacking what we think about resilience and specifically this practice of connection and thinking about it in a different way. And so often when we talk about connection, we think about the connections outside of ourselves. We think about our community, we think about our friends, our family, our peers at work, our teammates on our sports teams. And in fact, the place where connection starts is the connection that we have with ourselves. And connection with ourselves is about listening to the voice within. It's about trusting our gut, being able to hear our intuition, knowing what our strengths and talents are, knowing our worth and getting up from the table when we recognize that we are not being valued in the way that we would like to be. And when we don't have a connection to ourselves and instead focus all of that energy on our external connections, it's like a rootless plant, right? Everything that happens in the environment, the wind, the rain, it's just going to like blow us around, right? Whereas if we have the roots of being connected to ourselves, that grounds us into who we are. And it's tremendously powerful, because now the things that we're talking about are well-being, our mental health, our self-care, right? When people aren't taking care of themselves, when we're not eating healthy foods, when we're not going to the gym, when we're not getting our cardio in, when we're not hydrating, we're not doing that because we don't, generally speaking, know what foods are unhealthy. We don't know that we're not supposed to drink. We don't know. It's not that we don't know that we're supposed to drink water. That's how I want to say that. It's not that people don't know that we're not supposed to be active, we shouldn't be sedentary. It's not a knowledge problem. It's a worthiness problem.
Mm.
When we don't believe that we are worthy enough to take care of ourselves, we don't prioritize our own needs. And sometimes we even sabotage ourselves. So connection is about valuing this person first and foremost. And then from that place of knowing our value and worth, having relationships with other people.
I would love to hear your number one strategy to improve connection.
So let me first say that some of the conversations that I've been in recently have been about self-love, right? And also how we can love other people, how we can show up in this world with an incredible amount of grace and appreciation for our fellow humans. And what's important to recognize is so often we think about how we can be loving to everyone else. We're not putting as much of that focus on ourselves. And so what I tell people is our ability to love others is limited only by our ability to love ourselves. And people say, well, other people are easier to love. And I'll say, you know what? Sometimes they are, until they do something wrong. And then we're like, I shut you out of my life. Right? So starting from a place of loving ourselves. So how do we do that? What's the strategy? Okay. So I used to think, DJ, that the most important real estate that I owned or rented was the home that I lived in. Now what I know is the most important real estate that I have jurisdiction over is the real estate of my own mind. Let's go, mindset, right? The real estate of our minds, people, okay? So what's happening up here in our heads dictates everything else. So I developed something called what follows I am follows you.
Mm.
This means that whatever we're saying to ourselves in the real estate of our own minds, and we think thousands of thoughts a day, when we think I am, however we're filling in that blank in the real estate of our minds is important. Because what we're saying to ourselves after I am is the greatest predictor of who we will become tomorrow and what our performance will be today. Okay, so what we can do, here's a simple strategy. It can take 24 hours. The first time you do it is you get a piece of paper, you draw a line down the middle, and on one side you write positive, and on one side at the top of the paper you write negative. Do an audit of the real of your mind for 24 hours. So you start to become aware of what's happening up there, this voice in your head. We're allowed to hear voices in our heads, just so everybody knows. It's okay. I mean, not like a lot of voices, just one voice. If you have more voices, we can talk about that. But so what is this voice in our heads saying? And then we write that down. If after I am, we're saying a positive thing to ourselves, great. Write that down on the positive side of the paper, right? You are worthy. You are great. You are strong. You are powerful. You looking good today, girlfriend. Like whatever it is, you know? And then when we say negative things to ourselves, write that down on the other side of the paper. Now, what's going to happen for the vast majority of people, and this is what happened for me the first time I did this too, is I had like a couple things on the positive side, and then like the whole negative side was like filled and like little writing and like flipped it over, like I needed more paper. It's amazing, right? Because I realized all the negative crap that I was saying to myself in the real estate of my own mind. And here's the part that really took me back. When I looked at those negative things that I had written, that I thought to myself in the real estate of my own mind, I thought, you know what? If I was in a relationship with someone and they said this to me, that relationship would have been over a long time ago. So why am I allowing this relationship with myself to perpetuate that?
I want to reiterate that, listeners. I've found that what follows I am follows you. I've found that what follows I am follows you. That's powerful stuff. Love it. Let's go on to number 4. Number 4 is such a cool chapter because you made up your own word. The practice of gratuosity is gratitude and generosity combined. I'll let you take the floor and teach us, what is the practice of gratuosity, Dr. Taryn?
Yeah, so good. So once again, this wasn't me kind of, coming up with the 5 P's of resilience or something like that. I was really trying to understand what I was learning from the people that I was interviewing. And so what I heard were 2 things that seemed to go together hand in hand. One was a sense of gratitude. And that might seem silly when we're thinking about challenge, change, and complexity. But some of the most resilient people that I interviewed found that for them, the difference between folding up in the face of challenge and the difference between flourishing later on was being able to look at that challenge, even if they hadn't chosen it, and to be able to see the good in it, to be able to see a sense of gratitude for what had happened, even if they wouldn't have chosen it, right? This is not about, sort of toxic positivity. It's about doing the work and being able to look on something that was tremendously difficult and also say, you know what, I wouldn't have chosen it, and I'm grateful that happened. Because I was in that horrific car accident, they caught the cancer early. Because I had the opportunity to move cross country, for this new role, was put in moments of meeting new people and having the opportunity to travel in a way that I never have before. When I lost my job, I thought things were over. And now I see that the role that I got since would never have happened if that first one didn't go away. So that's gratiosity. It's being able to see the good in the challenge.
Hmm.
The second part, the generosity, is telling our stories generously. And this does 2 important things for us and for the planet. When we tell our stories of resilience, what this does is it solidifies for us how we demonstrate a resilience. It enhances our competence, our self-esteem, because we're telling ourselves a story about how we overcame, how we were strong in the face of ambiguity, how we created clarity in the midst of chaos. And the second thing happens when we tell our resilient stories, it also becomes part of someone else's roadmap. Someone looks at us and they say, oh, DJ did it, so I can too. And I'm convinced that as humans, we talk about healing, we talk about self-actualization. I am convinced that our highest level healing is when we can take the things that happened to us, the things that felt dark, the things that felt broken, and alchemize them through our resilient stories so that we take that darkness and we shine a light on somebody else's path in the midst of their challenge. We become part of their survival guide. And rather than that thing continuing to be perpetuated as a bad negative thing, it becomes part of something that encourages and takes care of others.
So well said. This reminds me of a story. There's a famous CrossFit athlete named Cole Sager, and I heard him on a podcast talk about him and his wife were pregnant, and the baby came extremely early, and there was a lot of complications in the NICU, not really knowing what the future was going to look like. Baby came out after several weeks. Everything is fine. Everything is good in hindsight. On the podcast, the interviewer asked him, "Hey Cole, like, what are your thoughts when you look back on that time in your life? It was just such a tough 6 months for you and your family. I mean, you probably got to this victim mindset. You probably were furious, and you and he in just a deep calming sense, he goes, actually, I'm grateful." And the podcast host was like, "You're grateful? What do you mean? I mean, that was a brutal 6 months." He said, "I'm grateful because my family is equipped to handle this adversity. And I'm grateful that another family didn't have to go through what we went through. I'm grateful that it happened to us because we can handle it." And it was like goosebumps. Whoa. Right. That to me, and you tell me if I'm wrong, but that is the practice of gratuosity, being grateful for the adversity, not in a toxic positivity. I like how you said that, right? We're not just looking for trouble and looking for adversity, and but there is a finite of something's going to come out of this, and I'm grateful it's happening to me because I can handle it.
Mhm. Yeah. I mean, that is a perfect, story to illustrate this practice. And, one of the things that I want to point out is that the practice of gratiosity, and particularly being able to find the good or even the gratitude in the challenge and to solidify what that story is, that typically is not happening in the moment, right? That man and his wife were not generally sitting in the NICU saying, like, we're really building character right now. This is so great. We're going to have such a great story to tell people, right? In that moment, we are not feeling grateful. We are feeling afraid. We're feeling like the rug has gotten pulled out from underneath us, confused, angry, all of the feelings. And so the part about toxic positivity is it's really important that we work through that, that we're present to that. And just as the dots line up, hindsight being 2020, what happens later on is we can look back, and that's oftentimes the lens or the vantage point from which we can see, oh, now I see the good.
I recently read a story about, or a study actually, about cancer survivors, and this connects really well to this. And they asked these cancer survivors, and I'm just summarizing the point of this, but Dr. Taryn, they asked these cancer survivors, "Hey, if you guys got the chance to go back in life, and you got to play a different card or go through life without getting the diagnosis, would you do it?" And we're all thinking, all the scientists are thinking, yes, of course they're going to do this. It's going to be a resounding yes. And it was like a 98% said no. And it was like mind blowing to these scientists and these researchers, because the reason is, if I didn't go through that, I wouldn't be the person that I am today. And it was just such
That's
I
right.
mean, we all try to avoid, nobody wants to have cancer, yet all these people are standing on the other side saying, nope, I would do that. I would do this again.
Hmm. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. It becomes part of our DNA. I tell stories, I tell other people's resilient stories in my book, The 5 Practices of Highly Resilient People. I tell my own stories of resilience. I was on a podcast not too long ago with an interviewer by the name of Ed Milet. He has a
It's a
leading
phenomenal episode, by the
business
way.
podcast. What's that?
I listened to it twice. It's a great podcast episode.
Thank you. Thank you so much. He's an incredible interviewer. And one of the questions that he asked me is, would I go back and change things? There's a story in my book about having a stalker, and that stalker going to prison for 2 decades for brutally raping and attacking another woman in my neighborhood. And I talk about, and I was in captivity too, because I developed 2 decades of post-traumatic stress disorder. And I've got my story of undiagnosed learning disabilities, right? Like we all have our resilient stories. And yet I wouldn't go back and change any of it because it becomes part of the fabric of who we are. And I'm so grateful for who I've gotten to be today with all of it.
Amazing. Let's close down with the final one, the practice of possibility.
The practice of possibility. So this is number 5 for those people that are, if you're counting at home, this is the final practice. And so it's interesting the way these practices ended up evolving inside of my interviews, because what I found is like vulnerability is really the foundation,
Mhm.
and possibility is kind of this like actualized way that we begin to face challenge with practice, right? And the word practice, we asked this earlier, is intentional because it's not about perfection. It's about with each moment in our life that's challenging, practicing, these things that help us more effectively address challenge. So possibility is first and foremost about focusing on progress, not perfection. And anytime we face challenge, there's an element of risk and there's an element of opportunity. And people who most effectively engage in the practice of possibility are able to see both. Oftentimes, when we're in the midst of challenge, we index on risk. This is terrible. What's going to happen? What are we going to do? It's going to change our whole lives. It's not what we wanted, right? And then there's also this moment of that's the risk. And then there's also this moment of like opportunity where we're like, okay, well, what if we did lose all of our savings? What are we going to do then? What's the, what can we do next? Um, and so the most resilient people who flourished in the face of challenge were able to acknowledge and see the risk, and also acknowledge and see the opportunity, and not over index on one or the other, but have a really balanced perspective in that moment of challenge.
I love that. I love that you said progress over perfection. Perfection and the word perfect is a word that I try to eliminate from all of my athletes that I work with. I just think it's never useful with what we're trying to do. I like progress and slow progress over time. One of the skills I teach is process over outcome. Let's focus on your daily process. Your future will take care of itself when you take care of today. Let's focus on today instead of getting filled into what does the outcome look like. Talk to me a little about progress, perfection. What does that look like? What does that mean to you?
Yeah. Well, I think if we continue with athletes, one of the things that we know about getting in shape and, changing the quality of our health and sort of the composition of our body is that that often goes at its own pace. And so focusing on progress in that sense means, focusing on the things that we can control, the inputs, eating healthy, eating at the right times, getting the workout in, getting the cardio in. And even if we're not seeing gains, for example, on a scale, we can find gains and progress other places. Maybe we can, now run a mile without stopping or without being out of breath, cardiovascular gains. Maybe we find that our clothes are fitting differently, even if the number on the scale stays the same. And so, I think what happens with perfection a lot of times is it derails us. We think we miss one workout, we eat one thing that we think we're not supposed to, and it's like, well, I had one donut, so why not 7? You know? And that perfection standard is so stringent and so shaming for so many of us, that if we instead focus on progress. I don't know what you sort of say to your athletes, right? But a lot of trainers will say, well, we do like an 80-20 rule in terms of food, or a 90-10 rule. Like 80 or 90% of the time, we want you to be eating the healthy foods and the right portions that are kind of on plan. And 10 to 20, percent of the time, or, whatever it is, you can engage in. I like to say treat, not cheat, because I think cheat is shaming, not cheating, having a treat. And, I think then that mindset of, okay, in life, if I'm doing a thing, 80 to 90%, to level, that's tremendous progress.
This has been awesome, Dr. Taryn. I like to close down my episodes with asking for a piece of advice. We gave so much content. The book is full of it. But if we're just trying to dial it down to this kind of this one question, Dr. Taryn, for the listeners out there driving in their car right now, they're thinking, man, this is great. I want to become a more resilient person. I've always wanted to be more resilient. Dr. Taryn, what's one thing that my listeners can do right now to become more resilient? What's one thing they can do?
One thing to do is to realize that the vast majority of us exist inside of a paradox, that we are both a work in progress and a masterpiece. I talk about this at the end of my book. Um, this idea that we get to love and cherish and appreciate who we are today in this moment. We are a masterpiece, as we would with artwork. And we're also a work in progress. We're not going to stop there. We're going to continue to grow. We're going to put some more paint strokes in there. We're going to, refine the vessel of this pottery, whatever kind of masterpiece you want to be. And that it's okay to live at the intersection of that paradox. Our brains don't want to allow two things that are at odds typically to be true. And yet, all of us, just in the moment that we're in today, we are a masterpiece, and to also recognize that we're all works in progress.
Love it. What a great place to end. The Five Practices of Highly Resilient People, while some flourish when others fold. Phenomenal book, you guys. Go and get this. Dr. Taryn, other than getting, well, first, where can they get the book? And then additionally, if they want to help support you more, where can they do that? What does that look like? The floor is yours.
Amazing. Yeah, you can easily grab that book on Amazon, Audible, wherever you typically order your books from. And if you're hanging out on Instagram, I would love to hear from you. So go ahead, follow me, Dr. Taryn Marie. And if you send me a direct message, if you write the word flourish in the message, I will actually send you our free guide that expands on the five practices and gives you an opportunity to do exercises and reflections that can help you embed this more into your life.
Hmm. Dr. Taryn, thanks for the time. You're so brilliant. You're a beautiful speaker. You just do such a great job conveying such a great message and getting through some of the myths and misconceptions of it. This was just truly a joy. Thank you for taking the time.
Thank you. It's an honor to be a guest on your show. Thank you so much for having me.